and welcome to the Save British Farming podcast, the new show where we're going to talk about food, agriculture, climate. There may even be some unsolicited relationship advice with me, Ollie Fletcher of the Farming Expand YouTube channel, and
Liz Webster, founder of Save British Farming, someone that has been trying to fight to save British farming for some considerable time. And you might ask, why does British farming need saving? Perhaps we should start with that, Ollie.
yes, I am quite new to all of this, really. I've been doing it about a year, but Liz hunted me down and introduced me to her campaign, which has been going on for very, very many years. You're something of a veteran now.
I am, yes. And really, my whole scope about food and farming began when I was a child because my grandfather was a cook in the RAF and he was sent to India in the war. And he indoctrinated me with a fear of not having enough food. And for me, that is what drives me forward, because I always recognised that we were being kettled towards a food crisis, or several food crises. I also remember some of the food crises that we had in the 1970s. And so I'm motivated to try and communicate these things, because what I've noticed is that for some reason in Britain, a lot of people don't realise that their food comes from farms and not supermarkets. And so that's really where we began.
A lot of people will have seen in the news that Save British Farming led a protest in London on the 10th of February, where 1,400 tractors attended to protest against this government's handling of the agricultural sector. But this isn't the beginning, as you hinted there. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about what the campaign has done up to this point?
Yeah, in the past, we took sheep to London. And this is before Brexit happened, because I've always recognised that Brexit is an existential threat to British farming and British food and food security, all of these buzzwords that are pushed around all the time. Ultimately, Brexit was a really damaging thing for trade, and particularly goods trade, and food is at the heart of that goods trade. So we were exercised to try and inform people about that, because actually the Remain campaign were very poor and weak on the food and farming side. The Leave side hijacked it largely and made out that Brexit was going to deliver cheap food as well as make farming amazing again. And none of it really made sense to me, but I understood the basics of why leaving the single market would be bad for British farming. So we took sheep to Westminster and we launched a report by Sean Rickard, who used to be the chief economist of the NFU, to try and explain to the press what a no-deal Brexit in particular would do to farming. And then I had the biggest ever anti-Brexit slogan in the world on this farm I worked with, led by donkeys. And that was very exciting. And but sadly, it failed and we Brexited. And then we also have taken tractors to London. We started in 2020. We've done lots of local tractor demos over the years, trying to get these messages out, as well as we've been up to Parliament Green. In fact, Daniel Zeitner, who is now in office as the farming minister, has come along and supported many of the different things that we've done. A lot of activities were done on Zoom at one stage because of COVID. And that's how we are where we are. So we've been talking about farming and politics for the last 6 or 7 years, really focusing on that. And yes, the governments have changed. We've had several prime minister, but the issue still remains that farming is under attack, which means everybody's food is under attack. Statistics are showing that we were largely right about most of our predictions, and we're still facing a huge battle, which is why we decided to do a podcast, to try and communicate and bring people together, because at the moment, the lack of cohesion around and understanding around the fact that if you eat, and that includes pets, wildlife, You are involved in agriculture. So if a government is pointing its guns at farming and agriculture, it's pointing its guns at all of us who rely on food to survive. I happened to watch your film on YouTube, and I was like, wow, this is the piece of the jigsaw that's missing. Ollie
I
Fletcher,
Yeah. What do you think?
history graduate, who understands that to explain farming, we've got to use history. And so that's why I reached out to you. And that's why I think we make a good partnership.
Yes,
What do
well,
you
perhaps
think?
time will tell. No, Liz, I think we're an excellent partnership. I cherish all of the advice that you give me. So I grew up on a 120-acre dairy farm, milking about 120 cows. Very much, a small family unit. We used to employ a couple of people, but unfortunately, we were sunk essentially by Brexit. After Brexit, we struggled to maintain our staff because the exchange rate changed, and a lot of them went home again to their home countries. And with the removal of the basic payments, it just became unsustainable. So we still have the farm, and I'm very passionate about keeping the farm going, if for no other reason, so that the next generation have a connection with the land and animals and the natural world that I had when I was a child. So, to my father's extreme disappointment, I have purchased some pedigree Leicester Longwool sheep, which he's quite furious about. He doesn't like sheep at all, and he particularly doesn't like pedigree animals because he thinks they're a complete waste of time and money. Um, but I think he's slowly warming to them, and the idea, hopefully, is to sell wool or wool products direct to consumer. Yeah, I could do. I could knit him a
We
sweater.
need to we need to see some pictures of the longhorn sheep.
Um,
I need to meet these longhorn sheep. I'm going to come up to
oh,
your farm,
yes,
Ollie, in
yes,
one of these
do.
episodes, and we're going to have some bonding with the sheep. My husband doesn't like sheep either.
No, my dad doesn't like sheep, but funnily enough, they're so tame. There's only about 500 breeding ewes left in the world, I think, but because they're so rare, they're essentially pets. And being docile has been bred into them generation after generation. And we went up to move them the other day with our old cattle trailer, and I opened the door, and all of them immediately just walked straight in, and we closed it again with no handling or anything. We
No
let the
dog,
back
no
down.
sheepdog.
No, nothing. I hadn't even mentally prepared myself to get them in. I was just thinking about, where should I put the fences, where should I stand, all this sort of stuff.
And what
They
you
just
should have
walked
been
straight
doing,
in.
Ollie, was videoing it. Did
Yeah,
you
I
video?
know. I should have filmed it. I was laughing my head off, and I turned to my dad and I was like, "Have you ever seen anything like that before in your life?" And he said that he hadn't. And he still maintains that he hates sheep because they're so close to the ground. But I keep telling him that you don't even have to handle them because they just do exactly what you want them to. They're very funny.
I think, yeah, we've got friends who've got sheep over in Oxfordshire, and in fact, I'll have to try and dig out the video of them. I think they're fascinating. Yeah, I mean, because obviously we've got cattle, and I love cattle, but I would happily have some sheep. But yes, my husband's really against you, but I would happily have some pigs. I think pigs are great,
Pigs are a bit smelly though, aren't they?
but cattle are smelly.
Cattle poo is just water and grass though, isn't it? Both of those things are clean.
I still quite like some pigs. I still also like some horses, but yes, he definitely has no chance of me getting any horses. He says horses mean losses.
Yeah, no, we don't.
Mean
We're
losses.
not a horse farm,
Farming means
unfortunately.
losses.
This is true. This is true. But yeah, so we stopped milking about 2018, which is a great shame. I'm a strong believer in dairy farming. I think it is the highest mode of farming simply because you can manage it so intensively that you have a chance at perfecting the system, which I find very interesting. And after that, I did my A levels, went and worked on a few other farms, some dairy, some arable, for a year. And then I went to university, to Oxford, where I studied history. I sort of specialized in the 18th century because I did a module in the 18th century and spent the entire time chasing a girl with some limited success, and thereafter chose other modules on the 18th century to compensate, which did work, but it's only so relevant to the present day. But after that, I have done lots of reading about British agriculture during the war, which is an incredibly interesting topic because it gives us not only the situation we're in today, but also a lot of stuff that we think of as not necessarily directly related to agriculture, like environmentalism and indeed just British culture more broadly. So, very, very interesting thing to sink your teeth into. And that's how I ended up where I am today. Essentially, when I was at university, I found that a lot of people really don't like farmers on a primal level. There is a very real hatred of farmers, but at the
Which
same
is the
time,
opposite of what it's like in France and Germany.
yes, yeah. Well, I think I was in a particularly metropolitan bubble, but that's where the power sits. You see, these are the people who go on to be politicians and journalists, so they're a very influential minority. That little metropolitan bubble. But at the same time, you see, I think there is hope because they are very, very interested in food systems. Lots of talk about lots of talk about veganism and whatnot. And of course, from that, they're very interested in animals and nature and how people might interact with the land. So I think there is an opportunity here for a high level dialogue with them that will hopefully advertise the importance of British agriculture and rural culture because I think it answers a lot of the questions that people are asking at the moment.
I find it incredible that when we were doing the Remain campaign and we said that leaving the European Union would lead to war, I find it quite astonishing that here we are now. I spoke to my son today and was only examining that if you search the word conscription in your news today on Google, how much comes up that it's now there and out there that the government is looking towards conscription.
Mm.
And that's quite shocking because apparently we were scaremongering and there was no way that there was going to be war. But the other thing I find particularly shocking is that the government have worked out that we might need to bring back conscription, going back to the war. But they don't seem to have understood the need to feed not only those who are being conscripted, but also the rest of the populace. And the fact that the lesson that we learned from the last war about our geography and being an island
Mm.
was that food is a particularly strong weapon for our enemies to use against us, because getting supplies onto these islands is a target for our enemies. And I find it amazing and astonishing that the army actually perhaps are not thinking about this as they were in the late 1930s and 40s. What
Yes,
do
yeah.
you think?
Well, no, it's true. So in the well, before the First World War, we had a sort of free market system in agriculture, which had prevailed since the 1870s, which meant agriculture was not in a very good place in the First World War. And the government, obviously respecting its citizens as freedom loving Englishmen, didn't want to intervene with the food supply, so resisted as long as it could. But in about 1917, they implemented some rationing and a system called the War Ags, the War Agricultural Executive Committees, that demanded farmers plow up the land to produce more food. And then they returned to the free market system after the war in something called the Great Betrayal. But then coming up to the Second World War, they re-implemented the War Ags in 1936, I believe. So the administrative infrastructure in case of a war was put in place several years before the war broke out. They were ahead of time. They were very conscious of the fact that if there is a war, we need to cover our own backs, which is something that they remembered from the Second World War all the way up to the present agricultural transition. But unfortunately, as you say, they seem to have forgot. They are talking explicitly about rearmament, about putting troops on the ground in Europe, while running down our food supply. It's very strange.
Yes, it's alarming, and I suppose that's another reason why we talk about these things, because in the last war, we did have a very big danger, starving in the early part of that war, and we managed to find a solution by sinking a lot of the enemy's boats. But we also don't really have a particularly powerful navy anymore. In fact, our army is largely you would call a militia. So we are in a very weak position. But really, for me, the starting block would have been not to do Brexit. Firstly, having done Brexit, I would have, or preparing for Brexit, there should have been at the forefront. Well, if we're going to do Brexit, we need to push up our food production, and we need to have a food production plan. But all we've had is a focus on the environment and biodiversity loss and all of those sort of arguments, which got Labour into power and Labour were going to be the greenest government ever, I seem to remember. And now they're dropping all of the green emphasis, and we've now got the fourth Heathrow runway. They want to build lots of houses, which I'm in agreement with. Building houses, we need them, of course, but there needs to be some balance on that. And they want to drill, baby, drill. So I don't really know where we are with this. It doesn't actually. It's hard to find any proper threaded through thinking.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to get into here, which I'm sure we'll unpack in the future in the podcast. But the food supply is going to be threatened by climate change inevitably, if not by war. So this is something that is very concerning. And obviously, climate change is sort of two sides to that coin. You have to prevent it, and you have to deal with the effects of it. And maintaining British agriculture, in a lot of ways, helps prevent climate change, because our climate is very well suited to growing the things that we grow well, like dairy, beef, cereals. We're very good at producing those things. So if we can produce them here for export potentially and produce a surplus, we can save people producing it in countries that are less suited to it.
Go further than that, Ollie. What we should have done, I mean, we're such a small country that us trying to get to net zero was really made no sense, or could make no difference. We were always the most sustainable farming model, really, largely in the world. And what we should have been doing was exporting the way that we farm, our methods of farming, trying to get America to be more sustainable in terms of how they farm. And so I always thought it was
A diplomatic mission. Yeah.
I think it was mad that we did run down our farming, our sustainable farming, to import more food from the other side of the world where they grow it, really in much worse methods. So it was always misleading, I think, and many
Yes.
environmental organisations are waking up to that. And I had a meeting with one of them just yesterday. They're called Feedback, and they've got a judicial review of the Australia trade deal, because what we're talking about is exactly the trade policy that we've got now, where we are running down our own food to import it from Australia under this terrible deal. We know, we've heard a report that Boris Johnson was drunk when he signed that trade deal. And it was just a complete, I mean, the Australians laughed at us endlessly because we gave away so much in that deal. So Feedback, an environmental non-government association, have got a judicial review, which has been lost in the courts for the last 2 years. And the Labour government, the new Labour government, are appealing the court's decision to give this organisation a cost capping order, which is extraordinary given that it was a Conservative decision. You'd think that the Labour Party would want to highlight that the Conservatives not only signed a bad deal when Boris Johnson was drunk, but that also there is this judicial review, which is actually going to bring back, or it's actually complaining about the fact there was lack of parliamentary oversight of this deal, and that it's really bad for the environment, blah, blah, blah. You'd think the Labour Party would be going, great, we can let this go through the courts, and we can show that we're so much better than the Conservatives and win some points. But no, they're digging in and they're defending the previous Conservative administration's decision under Boris Johnson that was signed. Liz Truss was Foreign Secretary, and they are deciding to double down and aggressively try and derail this judicial review, which is quite extraordinary, don't you think?
Yes. Yeah, it is. All right. You point to something broader there, I feel, which is that people seem to have lost touch with rural ideology, which is something as complicated and varied as urban ideology, the whole left and right wing stuff we're all very used to talking about. But what I think that means is that the Labour Party, who are currently in government, are blindly continuing with the Conservatives' policies. So at the moment, they are doubling down on agricultural ideas that were dreamt up by Michael Gove. And no one in the Labour Party should agree with Michael Gove on anything, really. I don't think, but they are aligning themselves with his ideas as pertaining to the food supply, to nature, how people should relate to their environment, which I think is a fundamental failure. I think they've forgotten what a landscape that works with the people should look like, and they've forgotten what we need from the landscape, which is of course about the environment, but also about food, and it's about finding a balance between those two things, which the party doesn't seem to have even attempted to do. It's very strange, but that's why we need a conversation about it.
Yeah, well, we do, because we learnt this week from another farmer that David Lammy, Foreign Secretary, went to visit a farm, and the farmer said that David Lammy didn't even know about the argument about inheritance tax debacle, which was brought in the last budget, which just seems incredible that a foreign secretary, a member of the cabinet, would not be awake to the tensions that have been brought with the inheritance tax. Because I'm pretty sure if I went out into the high street and you asked 50 people, I'm pretty sure half of them would know about
Mm.
the farming community being very exercised about the budget changes, particularly inheritance tax. So, but that just shows why we need these levels of communication, because ultimately government ministers and MPs are only people, and they've got several layers around them. And what we're trying to do is to break through those layers to get our message to them, which is about the fact that they also need to eat.
Mm.
They need our food. They live on this island, and we need to try and remind them of the lessons of history, which you're bringing very eloquently, and our ideology and our concerns about the fact that we do need some sensible thought around food and
Mm.
a food production plan. And that we also, not only that, hold the answers to growth. If they go and adopt a food production plan, we'll also be able to ensure economic growth as well. Because at the moment, when you're importing a lot of food, you're actually supporting countries outside.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I did when I did economics at A level. There was lots of talk of balance of payments, and don't think I've heard anybody mention that term since. And that was some 6 years ago now. It's very strange to me that they're prepared to run down really what is one of the last or the last primary industry in this country and just send more money abroad. I feel like Britain is slowly becoming one giant consumption hub where we produce nothing. And there's lots of very interesting stuff going on there, because a lot of the time that's framed as environmentalism, where we don't want heavy industry. Heavy industry is bad, so we'll stop doing that. But we don't want a reduction in living standards, and essentially that just means we offshore the industry, and the industry happens somewhere you don't see it. But I was thinking about that recently, and that's Thatcherism. Really, we're going to run down the heavy industry. We're going to become a service economy, and we'll maintain living standards and
Patrick
import
Minford,
everything.
her economist, the guy behind the poll tax.
Yeah, so
And
very interesting.
yes, singing
Yeah.
the praises of Brexit, that we should run everything down and import it all. Yes, that's exactly it. And the Labour Party, who are in government, are continuing this catastrophe, because it is a catastrophe, because we lose total control. We did this with, as John McTernan pointed out, we had the miners' strike, we got rid of industry, we actually imported coal from China, which China benefited from it hugely, and they're now wanting to do exactly the same thing with food. And that leaves us in a very difficult position when the world is pivoting towards crisis and war. Crisis with the climate and tensions around geopolitics, war, Donald Trump, Ukraine, all of these things. And you just wonder where is the intelligent thought and planning within government, be that the civil service. Probably that's where it ought to be. They're the ones that are instructing the ministers. But there does seem to be an absence of responsibility. And that, I must admit, when I had a meeting back in 2020 with Henry Dimbleby, who was instructed by Michael Gove to write the food plan, he told me that food was no longer seen as a public good, only the environment is. And that is when I really felt very alarmed, actually, because if a government doesn't see it as its duty to ensure that the citizens have food, and we're on this island which has nearly starved in the past, I find it seriously concerning, especially having done Brexit, because we had our food supply underpinned in our European Union membership. We had, if we gave up farming in Britain when we were still in the EU, we would have been fine because we had a guaranteed supply from Europe.
Yeah. Not to fuel your tirade about Brexit, but I have noticed when we've been in London at all the protests, there's lots of people on the political left sort of look at us and say, "Well, you're protesting about Brexit. Essentially, you're complaining because you've lost the common agricultural policy. Why didn't you do this before the referendum? That would have been much more productive."
Well, yes, if I could go back in time, then I probably would do exactly what we've been doing in this, particularly in this last year or so. But when Brexit happened, we had the referendum. I wasn't campaigning. I didn't really have much of a platform, and it was only really Brexit's the Remain campaign's failure which exercised me into where I am now. And it's taken many years to get to where we are. So as I said at the earlier on, the Remain campaign failed to actually use farming and food in the campaign. And it was always the most unifying topic because we all need food. And the Leave campaign harnessed it by promising cheap food and footwear and all of this sort of stuff, as well as saying to farmers, oh, we'll get you the best support and we'll have this. And they promised to be all things to all men. But the Remain campaign barely mentioned farming. They didn't go on farms. They didn't ask farmers to do anything. And as a result, the country decided that all farmers were Brexiteers when that's just not true.
Yeah. Well, this ties into what I was saying earlier, where I feel like people have just forgotten about rural ideology. I think there's a sense that the entire countryside is conservative, either in a big C or in a small c sense. But there are socialist agrarian policies. We've had a socialist agrarian policy since the war up until the agricultural transition that was put in place by the Labour Party in Attlee's government, but rather, to ensure that the working people in the cities had access to a food supply. But it's very strange to me that they seem to have completely abandoned this chain of thought and just castigate the entire countryside as fundamentally conservative. And then, we can speculate as to whether or not that makes us their political enemy. But I think we need to both win the argument about why British agriculture is important with this campaign, but also on a much more fundamental level, convince them that it's worth having a conversation about. Because I don't think the government, or even maybe any political party, currently believes that it's worth talking about this stuff. It sits very low on their radar, as Zeichler said just last week.
Yeah, because the success that we have seen with the supermarkets when they came in, and they started to come in actually during the war with Tesco.
Well, you're in luck, because I understand that next episode we will be discussing the RPM, the supermarkets, and all of the economics of the agricultural sector, which I'm sure will be absolutely fascinating.
I just can't wait till the next episode to get really stuck into my favourite topic, RPM, resale price maintenance, to give you a clue. And look forward to chatting to you soon, Ollie. Take care, everyone. Speak soon.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. See you then.